All right, welcome back. So, this mini lecture is going to talk about the election of 1860, and we're going to talk about 5 things to think about in this time period. Before we do that, first things first, got to make sure that we get this out of the way. The American Civil War was over slavery. All right? I don't know how many times that we need to say this, but the American Civil War was over slavery. It wasn't over states' rights, and even if it was, the singular right that they're fighting for is the right to be able to enslave humans. So the Civil War was over slavery. Let us not separate this. Let us not sort of do whatever. The Civil War was over slavery. All right, cool? Everybody's good? All right. So, first thing we got to know. Slavery and the territories. So, Mexican-American War happens in the 1840s. This leads to the decline of something called the second party system. With this, you see the resurrection of the systems and parties and the creation of the Republican Party. And in the political machinations of this in the 1850s, what you're going to see is the rise of the issue of, okay, now there is all this territory that's been acquired from the nation of Mexico. What do we do with it? We had this Missouri Compromise thing. Now, it's kind of going to come up. And so that forms a big part of the political discussion for the election of 1860. Secondly, John Brown and 1859. All right, so there is the question of why does the Civil War happen, and why does the Civil War happen when it does? 1859, John Brown attempts to carry out a slave uprising in Harper's Ferry, beginning in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He is caught, it is stopped, he's put on trial, and he is executed. Now, were there a lot of different beliefs in the abolitionist movement in the U.S. prior to 1859? Absolutely. Did some believe in violence? Yes, they did. Did some not believe in violence? Yes, that's also true. Did some also believe it was okay to be anti-slavery but also pro-white supremacy? Yep, they also believed that too. John Brown's actions, though, to Southern elite plantation owners and to many across the South, you got to imagine it's sort of like a confirmation bias, right? So they see this kind of thing happening. They think he is connected to other abolitionists and to the Republicans. So when Lincoln is running for election in 1860, even though he says he can't do anything about slavery where it exists, they don't really believe him. So, third, Lincoln. All right, Lincoln's born February 12th, 1809. He is an impoverished individual on the frontier, when he is in his youth. He is mostly self-educated, mostly self-taught, and makes his way up to becoming a rising professional member of the upper middle class in Springfield by the middle part of the 19th century. He is actively involved in politics and becomes a Republican by the end of the 1850s and wins the nomination from the Republicans for the presidency in that particular election. Lincoln was not particularly a radical in his time period. He was someone who was opposed to slavery, but he would not be considered perhaps radical to that end. Lincoln was of the view, again, that while the president could have something to do with the question of the extension of slavery into the territories, that where it existed, that wasn't particularly Lincoln's prerogative. Although the president's prerogative. Although, of course, he does get Senator Douglas to admit an openness to ending slavery with something called the Freeport Doctrine when they're going through the speeches and debates for the election for the Senate in 1858. All right. So Lincoln is a popular figure, at least amongst aspects of the public, partly because he is so common. He's so tall, he's dressed gangly, he has a rather homespun sort of speech pattern, and the public is very much drawn to him. The beard as well, right, of course, is something that folks really enjoyed. Now, his main opponent will be Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois. Douglas was a titan, really, in the Senate for a number of years, was a very charismatic and very powerful political figure. And he will lose, partly because of the Freeport Doctrine, a great deal of political credibility in the South, and so campaigning will be very difficult for him. Now, Lincoln does, and this would be our fifth thing, Lincoln does, of course, emerge successful in the election. And so Lincoln's election, the fifth thing, it would be secession. Lincoln's election really guarantees or really indicates or signals to factions, of course, in what would become the Confederacy, that the federal government doesn't represent their interests and that they were essentially moving against not only the institution of slavery, but they, of course, define the institution of slavery as being, functionally a part of their homes and lives and all that stuff. And so the first state to secede, of course, is going to be South Carolina, and they're going to vote to do so in December of 1860. And in looking at the secession declarations, not only for South Carolina, but for many of these other states that will secede, again, they're making it abundantly clear that slavery is the primary motive. The desire to maintain slavery is the primary motive for why they are seceding. All right. Thanks very much.